So I had a really interesting tactic in a game that I felt deserved its own video that I wanted to show off. It's possibly the most complicated tactic that I saw in a game that netted me a win, so I was extremely proud of it. I'm going to try to gear commentary and explanation here toward lower level players to try to make some kind of educational content regarding how to look at tactics. But by all means, if you're a higher level player, you want to try to solve it yourself, or perhaps you've already solved it yourself if you're significantly higher elo than me, feel free to pause the video if you want to try to look at it yourself. I'll start with a basic explanation of the board. So here, black is down a pawn, but is trying to create counterplay by double attacking this pawn, which is relatively weak because it's not linked to the other pawns. It is only currently being defended by the queen. Black is trying to add the extra attacker, now it's 2-1. And white responds not bothering to try to defend the pawn, but rather to counterattack elsewhere, specifically on this knight. Now, if you look at the available moves for this knight to try to dodge the attack, you'll notice that anywhere that it goes, it can be captured. The only one that's a little bit more interesting is here, because you might say it's defended, but note that it is being attacked twice. So you would end up losing both of these for the bishop. So this knight has nowhere it can go to where it won't be captured, and it looks like white is going to win material. Now, if you look at what the engine has to say about this move, it absolutely hates it. Terrible move. So why does the engine hate this move so much? Why is this move so bad? Well, it turns out that in this position, black has an absolutely disgusting set of moves that completely wins the game. And the start of that sequence is to take this pawn with the rook. Because in this position, while the knight is being attacked, by doing this, black is attacking the queen. And the queen cannot counterattack because it is defended by this queen. So this is a concept that is sometimes described as danger levels. Black can ignore the danger by putting his opponent in more danger. So white is the one who's actually on the defensive here. Another thing to note is that this pawn was pinned previously. By pin, I mean that the queen would have direct line of sight to the king, and therefore this pawn could never move. So that was one extra thing making it a little bit more difficult. One way you might have thought to defend this pawn is not actually to add a piece defending it, but simply to push it up and therefore make it defended by the knight and the queen at the same time, while also attacking this pawn. Or this rook, rather. But that was not an available option because of this pin. And that's going to be relevant in a bit. Because now, if you look at this, the queen is the one that wants to look for a place to go. Well, if he chooses to retreat. He does have another option, which we'll talk about later. If you look here, the only two tiles that the queen can go to safely are here on c1 and here on g2. In the game, my opponent chose to go to g2. And one thing that's important to realize is with this pawn gone, the line of sight for the queen is now back. So this allows us to do what's called a discovered attack. A discovered attack is where you attack with a piece without moving it, which is normally how you'd think you'd attack with a piece, but rather by moving something out of the way. So anywhere this rook moves, doesn't matter where, will automatically come with check. And that means we can get away with doing something a lot more aggressive than we normally would be able to. For example, rook d2. Now normally, putting the rook on a tile like this would be suicide. It is being attacked twice over. But because we've removed the pin and therefore created a discovered attack, this rook can sit here and you cannot take it. White cannot take this piece because that does not resolve the check. Now, there are three things you can typically look at for how to get out of check. The most intuitive for newer players is to try to move the king out of the way. If you move the king out of the way here, this is absolutely devastating for you because you're going to lose your queen. And even if you take back, that's just a horrible loss of material. Black has counterattack. This is just not going to end well for you. The second way to try to get out of check would be to capture the attacking piece. However, the piece in question here did not actually move and wasn't in danger to begin with, so there is no way for white to capture this king, or this queen. So that leaves the third option, which is interposing, blocking the queen's line of sight to the king. So let's look to see if white can do that. Well, one way white can do that would be to move the bishop here. But this doesn't really help because black would simply capture the bishop, and now the attack is the exact same. You still have danger on both your king and your queen at the same time, and nothing has changed except you've lost your bishop. If this knight were somehow targeting this tile as well, then two pieces who could interpose to the same tile, it would make it so the queen couldn't come in safely. But that's not the case here. Now, white does have an interpose that may look like it solves all the problems, and that would be moving the rook to f2. It blocks the line of sight to the king. It also blocks the line of sight to the queen. So, and the rook is now covered twice with these two, being the two key threats we were looking at. And it may look like something is resolved here, but it's really not, because this knight is still here, and even though it's on death row and being threatened, and was the whole start to this chain, it still acts as a key attacking piece here. And so after the rook takes, if the queen tries to take back, this queen can simply come in, and the king cannot take back because of the knight, and white will end up getting checkmated here. And seeing that this was going to happen, after I played the rook to d2, white resigned in this position. He realized that with those two short moves, the game was over. Now, white did have other options here, which needed to be considered before I played rook d4. One of those was, well, what if he went over here? And at the time, I thought, a similar concept applies. This attack, and I could go here. Of course, it's not quite the same. It is a little bit trickier, because now if you interpose with the bishop, I can't take the bishop because you will simply take my queen, and I could take the queen back, but then you can take the rook back, and we're not quite in the same position here. It's not quite as simple. Now, this is still going to be a very good position for black. For example, what black could do is take the bishop here, and then we now have another discovered attack waiting to be seen if black were to try to take this. But there's actually even better than any of that, which is something that I did not see during the game. Perhaps I would have looked into it more as an option if I had seen my opponent play this as opposed to this, because I spent time thinking. Sorry about that. Headset cut out. That's a problem I'm going to have to fix at some point. Because I spent a lot of time thinking before playing this, but I spent more time thinking after this to confirm that it would work. But if white were to go here, the best move is actually not to go after the queen, but it's still to go rook d2. Because now, if the king tries to retreat, sure, we're not threatening the queen, but this is just checkmate. Again, because the knight holds everything together. And of course, now with this position, if white tries to interpose with the bishop, the queen does not have line of sight, so something like this would be absolutely devastating. And if the rook tries to block, we don't take with the rook, because then we don't have check, but we take with the queen, and there's just nothing that can be done here. Queen could go here or here. Either way, it's checkmate, and the game is over. So, could white have done anything better? Well, there is one line that I actually didn't see during my game, and it still doesn't end well for white, but it makes the most out of a bad situation. And that's to see this and take the one turn you have before you get put in check, and move the knight to a4. Because the whole point of this was that we said that white is the one that was put in danger now. Black can flip that by saying, okay, if you take my queen, I'll take your queen, and then I lose my knight afterwards, but you're still going to lose your knight. So, it seems like it'll go equal. So in this case, black's best move is actually just to take the knight. And note that this still does come with check, which means that white will not be able to recapture the knight here. And what it means going forward is after the king resolves the check, I believe the best move is to move the knight here, because it is double attacked by queen and bishop, but it is also double defended by queen and rook. Let's check that. It is, yes. So now, in this position, while this attack is not completely devastating to white's position, as it was in the other cases, black manages to save the knight and take white's knight instead. So even though it looked like black's knight was the one trapped, white is the one who ends up losing his knight in a best case scenario. And of course, black now has a very dominant, threatening position. This rook is currently being threatened. These lines are still available. The rooks are centralized and very scary going forward. This rook still has not been activated, and white's going to have some trouble finding a counterattack here. Note that back rank mate is not a threat because the queen is holding this tile. So anyway, just a very fascinating position that I was extremely proud of to see that taking this pawn, of all things, actually causes the dominoes to start falling and white's position to collapse. One of the most complicated tactics I've ever seen and actually succeeded at solving. It's one thing when you see a situation like this in puzzles and you know that there's a solution here. So you start looking for all kinds of common tactical patterns to find a solution. It is another thing entirely when you are put in a position in a real game where you don't know if on any given move you have a way to instantly win. But in this case, I was able to see it, and made me absolutely ecstatic. Anyway, that's about it for this video. I hope you learned something, or at least enjoyed the tactic. That's all. See ya.